the church calendar moves now. So we started back in December thinking about or waiting for the advent of Jesus, waiting for Messiah to come. And then after Christmas, we start to look at the gospel story, and then about 6 weeks ago, we hit Lent. And that's a journey that we take with Jesus towards the cross, and we ponder what that means, and we look at the life of Christ, and we try and extrapolate some lessons from it. Last Sunday, we had Easter Sunday, and we kind of blow the doors off a little bit then, and now the church calendar moves. So you may have noticed the weather has turned a little in the last few days. Winter seems to have fallen with a particularly sickening thud. The church calendar has moved with the season a little. And really what we're doing for the next period of time is, after celebrating the resurrection last week, we're starting to ask the question, so what? What does it mean to live in a world where resurrection happens, where resurrection is a reality? What does that look like? And we ask the question about, are our lives and our world any different because of Easter? And if so, how and in what ways? See, it's a pertinent question, particularly after Easter, where we celebrate and we talk about victory and we talk about the empty tomb and what that means and all of that sort of thing. It's worth taking a moment and looking at our lives and saying, am I different because of that? And there's probably two different ways of looking at it. Because when I look at my life broadly today, it looks a whole lot like it did last Sunday, and the Sunday before that, and the Sunday before that. And it's the same with the world. When I look at the world, it looks pretty much the same as before. Before Easter, there was illness and death. After last Sunday, there's still illness and death in the world. Before Easter, there was pain and brokenness. After Easter, those things are still a reality for people. The list of before and after comparisons could go on and on. And this is part of the challenge of Easter, because in some ways, things look a lot like they did before Easter. And that leads to a question. What do we do with that? I think the story that Elise read in today's gospel reading is constructed in two halves, and it's designed to show us that Jesus is not limited by our fears and our doubts, and he's not put off by our questions and our uncertainties any more than he is limited by locked doors. Here's what I think the gospel is really sharing with us today, that it's telling us a few things. It's telling us the resurrection is a big deal. It's telling us that the empty tomb is a life-changing event. It's telling us that the resurrection does make a difference in our lives. But it's also telling us that it takes time to work its way through. Resurrection takes time to become a reality. And in some ways, it's not a one-time event. It's something that we grow into. Living a resurrection story is part of a way of being. It's a process and a life to be lived. By the grace of God, we evolve into resurrected people through our relationships, not only with God, but with each other, and through the circumstances of our lives. And sometimes we look at our lives and we think, well, my life hasn't changed a lot because of last Sunday. But I want to encourage you this morning, God wastes nothing. Every day we are stepping into a resurrected life. It's not always easy, and some days are plain hard, and sometimes we don't notice the process. But I used to tell kids when I was in youth ministry, God is like rust. He doesn't sleep, and he keeps working. And I think part of what we need to grapple with when we think about the resurrection story or resurrection story in our life, is that there is a difference between facts and story. See, it's one thing to know a whole lot of facts. It's something else altogether to assimilate those facts and make them part of a lived story, part of a lived reality. Now, as we get into this, hear me say this really clearly. Facts matter. But the more defining issue for us is, how do we live into those facts? I had an example of this on, I think it was Easter Monday. You went walking with Sammy on Easter Monday, Adi? I'm about to use you in a sermon illustration, so if you want to run, now's the time. Okay. You're staying put. All right, so I went for a ride on Easter Monday morning, and I was a witness to, when I got back, I was witness to a conversation between Adi and Isabel. I say conversation, but it really wasn't that. It was Isabel giving Adi a whole lot of facts about marine biology, and Adi having to sit there and take it. Right? It occurred to me that as Adi made her escape, that I suspect that now that she knows all those facts about marine biology, Adi was going home almost completely unchanged. Not because of the facts that were in play, but because those facts weren't assimilated into her life story and weren't going to change her life story. Right? So the issue is that in some ways facts are one-dimensional. They're important, but stories are multi-dimensional. Facts inform the mind, but stories touch the heart. Facts transmit information. Stories tend to transform lives. Now, I guess one of the ways to think about it is this idea that a fact is static. It's something that happened. It's a snapshot of a particular moment and a point in time. But a story is dynamic. Like a movie, it can take us across time. And I think for the disciples last Sunday, Easter Sunday, that was a hard one because they had facts, but they had no story. On the same day that Mary finds the empty tomb and has this encounter with Jesus, the disciples locked themselves into a room because they were afraid. And it's not a stretch to imagine the disciples stewing in their fear and in their misery in that locked room, with their flimsy justifications for why they were there and why Friday happened the way it did. Probably carrying a little bit of shame in that as well. And the thing is, these guys had heard Mary's sermon. We talked about this last week, that 5-word sermon that she delivers. I have seen the Lord. A couple of them had even been to the empty tomb. And they knew something had happened, and yet those facts made zero difference for the disciples in that room. They were still behind locked doors. They were still stuck. They were still afraid. And it was because they had a set of facts in front of them, but they weren't living a resurrection story. They knew something had happened, but it hadn't been assimilated into a way of life. So here they are in their room, in the dark, alone, all by them. No. And suddenly, without knocking or even bothering to use the door, Jesus is there. Aside from being the greatest jump scare moment in the history of the world, I kind of wonder what went through the disciples' minds. I mean, if you've ever been in a room with someone you think is angry with you, you know the feeling of awkwardness when you look at them and you think, I don't know what's coming. Are they going to give it to me, both barrels? And you know that feeling of sort of seeing this person and tensing up, shoulders just being held a little bit more tightly. But instead, Jesus doesn't give them both barrels. He says to those who are closest to him and who abandon him in his greatest hour of need, peace be with you. And then he breathes his spirit onto them. And he says, go and tell people that forgiveness is real. Brilliant. So far, so good. Such a lovely part of the story. But the thing is, the following Sunday finds them in exactly the same place, behind locked doors, in a room. What do we do with that? See, sometimes I think we come to Easter Sunday and we see the empty tomb and we get excited and we expect to wake up on Monday to a whole new life and a whole new world. And we do in part, but part of that expectation is my fault. Right? Preachers like me, we get excited when we think about the resurrection. We kind of think about the possibilities and we talk about all of that stuff. But what do we do with the fact that our lives are the same on some level? Because I'm guessing for most of you, you woke on Easter Monday to the same life you had on Good Friday. I did. I learnt some marine biology facts on Easter Monday, but that's different. Waking up to the same life, it's not because the resurrection failed or because Jesus didn't do the Jesus thing in my life. It's because resurrection takes its time to work its way into my story. If you like, the Jesus thing takes time. So all I'm suggesting this morning is that while it is good and true and right to hold on to the facts of Easter, Jesus' death on the cross for us, the empty tomb and the victory and that encounter that Mary has in the garden, we also need to give thought and attention to claiming and living the story of the resurrection in our lives. See, the empty tomb is a fact. Resurrection is a story. It's almost like we need to begin to understand the resurrection as the movie of our life instead of a snapshot of Jesus' life. See, the fact of the empty tomb is not the story of the resurrection. The facts of Jesus' life are not the story of Jesus. And the facts of your life and my life are not the story of our life. They're part of it and they're an important part of it. But what we do with it and how we assimilate that and how it affects the way we treat other people, that's the story. Facts are just the starting point for the story. The fact of the empty tomb is the starting point for the resurrection story. Whatever facts you woke up to on Easter Monday are simply the starting point for your resurrection story. And that's certainly true for the disciples that are locked away on the Sunday night, afraid and in the dark, and just hoping to survive this ordeal. And after the encounter with Jesus, like I said, on the surface, not a lot changed. It took 50 days for the seed of fact to bloom into the story of Pentecost. But it started right there in that locked room, in a place where they were afraid. I think the issue is that so often we take the facts as the entire story. That snapshot as the entire story. And that's where the second half of the reading kicks in. A week later, as I said, we find that not much has changed. The disciples are in the same place, behind the locked doors again. And this time, Jesus appears to Thomas. Well, we're talking about facts and story. Think about what you know about Thomas. What do you know about him? What comes to mind when you hear his name? Doubt, isn't it? Doubting Thomas. He was a doubter. That Thomas doubted is very often the only fact that comes to mind when we hear his name. It's so prevalent it's become his nickname. And yet the thing is, there's much more to his life than just this one snapshot in time, this one moment. He was the guy who, when Jesus was heading back to see Lazarus, said, well, we may as well go with him and die with him as well. Thomas wasn't just a doubter. There was more to him than meet the eye. And we don't know why he wasn't there on the Sunday night. Maybe he'd scarpered because of fear. That's possible. But maybe there was more to the story than that. Maybe Thomas was just tired of hanging out with the other guys that night and needed some space to process. Maybe he needed a walk and just went to clear his head and missed the resurrection appearance the first time round because of that. Maybe he was running an errand. We don't know. But we take his initial reaction to be the only thing about him. What we know is that the other guys come to him and they give him their version of Mary's sermon. We have seen the Lord. And Thomas goes, well, yeah, good for you. But unless I see the mark and the nails in his hands, and I put my finger in the mark and in the spear, the hole in his side, I'm not going to believe. I'm not going to believe ghost stories. It's an understandable reaction. Because resurrection wasn't something that was anticipated. Again, one of the things I've been rolling around in my own mind this week is, what if the fact is just the starting point for the resurrection story? What if, for Thomas, this moment of doubt is just the start of his resurrection story? What if his initial response is not the whole story? What if where we start is less important than where we end up? And what if God knows that? John says Jesus shows up again, but this time Thomas is there. And Jesus offers Thomas exactly what he needs. Proof. Jesus offers himself for the touching, as if to say, look, buddy, the violence was real. You saw that. And yet, in letting him touch and showing him the scars, Jesus is also saying that violence didn't have the victory on that Friday. That the violence that Jesus suffered on the cross doesn't get to define who Jesus was. Maybe Jesus knows how hard it is to believe that violence has no victory if the pain isn't at least acknowledged. So Thomas touches. And in the process, Thomas goes from Thomas the doubter to Thomas the confessor. His response is beautiful. And we forget it. What does he say? When he touches, he says, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus says to him, "Believe." Nadia Bolz-Weber says this. She says that the story of a wounded and risen God re-narrates our lives back to us. In other words, when we encounter a God who bears scars and still lives, it changes the way we read our own story. Our wounds are not the end of our narrative. Our moments are not the whole picture. Our doubts are not the defining chapter of our lives. The facts of our pain become the starting point for something larger than we could write for ourselves. And that's a good thing, because I know that there are times when I could use a better story than the one I tell myself. See, ultimately, I don't need a religious reference manual or a question and answer book. Those things are not bad as starting points, and they're good. But what I really need is the living Word of God who helps me write a resurrection story, who transforms me as I go in the walking. I need a story that is bigger than my pain, but doesn't ignore it. I need a story that the culture that I live in, I need a story bigger than the culture I live in that helps me find a better way of living. I need a story that shows me something bigger than what I can see, bigger than what I fear, bigger than what the internet and its various algorithms are trying to convince me of every day. I need a resurrection story. And that resurrection story only becomes a reality as I live and I walk with Jesus, the resurrected one. But that story takes time to become my story. It's not enough for me just to memorize a set of facts, as good as they are. I need to live into those facts, to let them inform the way I treat other people, the way I approach the difficulties of life. I need to let them define my reality in relationship with Jesus. And we talked about Thomas being the doubter, but Thomas was so captivated by this bigger story that he discovers in Jesus that he ended up blabbing about it everywhere he went. This man that we call Doubting Thomas died a martyr after he was run through with 5 spears by 5 soldiers. That doesn't sound like a guy who's a doubter. It sounds like someone who grew and changed. Someone for whom the resurrection of Christ was real. Someone for whom the empty tomb made a difference. It just took a little time, as it does for most or maybe all of us. The story goes that Thomas took this story of the resurrected Christ all the way to Kerala in India. And there are about 80 generations of St. Thomas Christians that have followed after him and have kept blabbing the story and telling about it wherever they go. And that brings me great comfort because it tells me the story is still unfolding all around us. You know, Warwick's video with the the reconciliation stuff is part of that story unfolding around us. And in fact, nothing stops the story. It inspires me to keep looking for and living into the resurrection story that Jesus is writing in my life and yours. It gives me hope that nothing will stop the story of Jesus and us, his faltering friends, with our moments of doubt and confession and weakness and victory and triumph and loss and all the rest of it. And the story won't stop because it's the story of how the God of Easter keeps reaching into the graves we dig for ourselves and the rooms that we lock ourselves in and keeps loving us back to life. You know, all that stuff about doubting Thomas, the fact of his disbelief, that's just his starting point, no more and no less. In many ways, it's neither good nor bad. It's just the starting place. And we all have our starting places. So what's yours? What are the facts of your life today? The starting place for the story of our resurrection is whatever those facts are. Don Carson, who's a Bible commentator, he said a few times in a sermon that he's not suffering from anything that a good resurrection can't fix. And I think that's true for all of us. Whatever your life is today, whatever your circumstances are, that's the starting point for your story of resurrection. You know, it's all very well to sit and play, well, what if? You know, if this happened, if that happened, if something else happened. If I'd been born with wheels, I'd be a bike. Whatever it is. But your starting point is just that. So if you're dealing with loneliness this morning, or sorrow, or loss, that's your starting point, and that's the room that Jesus enters. If you're locked in a house of fear or darkness, that's your starting point and the place where Jesus stands. If it's old age, disability, or uncertainty, if they're the facts of your life, that's your starting point, the place where Jesus shows up. If you're feeling lost or betrayed or disappointed or overwhelmed, that's the house that Jesus enters. And that's where the story starts. And maybe you're at the other end of the spectrum. Maybe this morning your starting point is joy and gratitude and celebration, and they're the facts of your life. That's the starting point for your resurrection or your story of resurrection. See, the walls and the locked doors of the disciples' house couldn't keep Jesus out, and the walls and locked doors of our house won't keep him out either. He steps into the midst of our houses, through the locked doors, and he speaks peace and faith to us. He breathes hope and peace to us. He breathes peace and courage, or peace and strength. And that breath of peace is the key that unlocks the door. And so wherever your starting point is this morning, my encouragement is take a deep breath. Take it all in. Let Jesus fill you and enliven you. Let him give you the hope and courage and strength to unlock that door that's been locked for far too long. To open the door of your life. The door's jammed, open a window. See, the facts of Easter, they're exciting and they're good, and we celebrate them with good reason. They're worth remembering. But it's the story of the resurrection in our lives that helps us get out of the house and live the kind of life that God means us to live. To be the ambassadors and the carriers of the story that he means us to be. Ultimately, the story of the resurrection is that love will always conquer hate. Death has no sting, and forgiveness is more powerful than violence. And that despite it all, it is always, always, always worth it to love God and love people. Jesus meets us where we are. We don't have to attain some sort of place of standing before he comes to us. He meets us in our locked room and he speaks peace and he speaks faith and he encourages us to get out of the house. So my encouragement this morning is, if you're feeling discouraged because it's taking a little while, give it some time and see what Jesus can do. Why don't we pray, and Warwick and Steph will come and lead us. Lord, thank you for that story that you call us into, that story of life and resurrection, that story of a better way, that story that is bigger than us. Thank you, Lord, that you don't expect us to have it all together before you invite us onto that journey, that you meet us where we are. And Lord, this morning for each of us, whatever our starting point, would you meet us in that space? Would you breathe on us? And would you open the door and let us get out of the house? Lord, thank you that you do have a better story for us to write and to live into. You have a story that invites us into something that you are writing. And so, Lord, this morning we look for that. We look for you. And we choose to live into that. Lord, thank you for the facts of Easter that we can base our life on, that we can put our feet on. But help us not just keep them as facts, help us integrate those facts into the way that we treat the world around us. Amen.